Welcome back to One American Baseball Podcast. You are joining us for episode 37. I'm Chris, as always, joined by my co-host Jaden. And if you listen to this podcast, we cover the Guardians and Reds. And while you might be able to get rid of those two baseball teams in the playoffs, you can't get rid of us. We're still covering the Guardians and Reds every single week, and we plan on doing that all off season. So we're gonna break down each of the games and what we kind of saw in our takeaways, and we're also gonna kind of give a season outlook and sort of our closing thoughts about 72 to like 3 to 4 days after both of our teams got eliminated. And then after that, we're gonna kind of talk about the what we've seen in the division series and just around the league and stuff. So without further ado, let's get into it. Jaden, how you holding up after your Reds got eliminated?
Oh, Chris, I've had my mandatory 24-hour mourning period, and honestly, it was tough for me to be too upset with how this playoff series went. I mean, I'll get into it, but the Dodgers are a team that, um, they might repeat as world champions, which would be pretty not fun to watch, but that's the team we ran into. And that's just the way it goes. How are you holding up after your Guardians?
Yeah, I think what you brought up is interesting. There is a world where both of the teams that eliminated the our teams make the World Series and end up competing against each other. So I guess the to a big uh, a lot of copium we could use is if the Tigers and Dodgers make the World Series, then getting eliminated in the wild card round doesn't look too bad. But yeah,
That's very true.
I feel pretty much the same way about my Guardians. I'll get into them here. So um, yeah, game one, Gavin Williams was super dominant and he matched Tarek Skubal for about the first 6 innings, and then Tarek Skubal was doing, Skubal things, Cy Young candidate, probably going to win the Cy Young this year. Struck out 14 Guardians, and there's not really much you could do against that. Um, the Tarek Skubal kind of carved up the Mariners last night, so he's just going to do his kind of things. And the fact that we won 2 games in a row against Tarek Skubal, we were due to get a really good start out of him. And the thing that hurt the most about game one of the wild card series is how winnable of a game it was. In the first inning, Jonathan Rodriguez had that error where he there was a single that was hit to him, and then he kind of kicked it. It was a routine single, and he kicked the ball, and I think it was Riley Green who hit it. He ended up, or oh, it was Kerry Carpenter, one of the two, but one of the two ended up going to second base on that error, and then that run ended up coming in to score. So, and it was a 2-1 ball game, as you probably know. And there was another miscue later in the game where Jhonkensy Noel, there props to him for stopping that ball. There was a line drive that was hit to him that he knocked down and then kind of kicked away. And then he scrambled to back to first base because he saw that Brian Rocchio picked the ball up and he wasn't covering the bag. He probably panicked a little bit and kind of misread how much time he had just because that ball was hit so sharply. Um, I don't really know it like if if there was somebody else at first base, if they could have knocked that ball down, and like who knows how that play would have unfolded if somebody else was at first base. Jhonkensy Noel's a big guy. Um, but I will say that the Jonathan Rodriguez error was very preventable. And we could have kept the same lineup, the same order and everything if we just had a little bit different defensive alignment. And the way that Stephen Vogt kind of constructed that lineup, I don't think it really set the team up well for success. Jonathan Rodriguez has been really unreliable in the field, to say the least, throughout this year. And, we left him out there to dry in right field. And you DH Kyle Manzardo, which that was, he's not a great fielder, but at least you have somebody with big league experience at first base. And then you shift Jhonkensy Noel to right field, who is not a great fielder, but he's better than Jonathan Rodriguez. And I think that Jhonkensy Noel easily makes that play. He holds Kerry Carpenter to a single. So I think that just having a bit like a better defensive alignment would have saved us a run, at least a run there. Um, And, I think that Jonathan Rodriguez, if he's starting a playoff game, he should be the designated hitter. You can't trust Jonathan Rodriguez in the field, and it showed. Um, and there's too many Tigers who can hit the ball to right field, and I was very anxious the whole time, and Rodriguez proved me right in the first inning, unfortunately. Um, like I said, the offense didn't have any answers for Tarek Skubal. Um, they didn't they needed to take advantage of that Javier Baez and Spencer Torkelson error that got Jose Ramirez over to third base. This is my main issue with the offense is that the Guardians couldn't get the run home from third with nobody out. And you gotta if you want to win a playoff series, you gotta come through there. Like there's no excuses. Like the Tigers made a huge mistake and you didn't capitalize off it. That is completely on the Guardians. And even though they didn't play a super clean game, like they had a chance to win it in the ninth inning and they just couldn't come through. So um, yeah, that kind of not going to beat that to a dead horse. Very, very winnable game. And you move on to game two. This was a much better game. There were a lot of narratives. So I think the first one that I wanted to get into was the Chase DeLauder narrative. So he's making his big league debut, and that hasn't really happened very much in the history of the game, and for a good reason. Um, he was pretty rattled in that first inning. He dropped his first career fly ball, but props to Tanner Bybee on giving him a pep talk in the dugout after the first inning, after DeLauder dropped that fly ball, and that really seemed to calm Chase DeLauder down. And he ended up drawing two walks later in the game, and he ended up also throwing a runner out at third base, which also erased a run from scoring in the process. And that runner being thrown out at third base kind of shifted the momentum of the game. So I think, Chase DeLauder really, really helped in this game quite a lot. Not only offensively, but defensively. Tanner Bybee, he pitched 4 2/3 innings, but he was about as dominant as we've ever seen him the first 3 innings of the ball game. He pitched really well. Um, and yeah, that's about all I have for Tanner Bybee. Another kind of narrative is the offense. They did a really good job to put pressure on Casey Mize early and get him out of there after the third inning. George Valera hit his first career playoff home run, so that was huge. Kyle Manzardo also just missed a home run on really any other day, that probably would have been out. That was hit very well. And then Brian Rocchio kind of broke the tension there in a 1-1 ball game there in the eighth inning. And he's kind of started the 5-run rally, and then Bo Naylor 3-run homer sealed the game. So that was a super exciting game to listen to. Unfortunately, it was a 108 game, but I listened to the whole thing, so that was really fun. And then the bullpen usage kind of goes back to Stephen Vogt's management, sort of. The rally wasn't until the eighth inning, so they had to. I don't really blame Stephen Vogt at all for the bullpen usage in this game, but we didn't rally until the eighth inning, which is fine. So we had to use all of our high leverage relievers. You got to do what you got to do when your back's against the wall. Um, he burned through Eric Sabrowski, Hunter Gaddis, Tim Herron, Jacob Junis, and Kate Smith. Um, and the main issue that I had with the bullpen usage in this game, if I can cherry pick anything, was that Kate Smith threw 31 pitches. Now he came on with 2 outs in the eighth inning, and he threw 5 pitches to get that last out of the eighth inning. And then we had that rally, and you brought Kate Smith out there in a 6-1 game. Um, it kind of begs the question, do you bring in Matt Festa and favor Kate Smith there? I think that's a really tough decision, and it makes a lot of sense to go either way. On one end, when you leave Kate Smith there, you you offer a better chance to win the game. And then when you bring Festa in, you bring a fresh arm in, and then you kind of take some of the strain off of Matt Festa for game three. And but yeah, like I said, you don't feel as great about your chances of winning if you bring Matt Festa in. So it really is kind of a double-edged sword. But I think that given a 5-run cushion, I think Stephen Vogt could have afforded to bring Matt Festa in that situation. I think Unfortunately, Jacob Junis was burned through. Junis would have been a good option in the ninth inning. I think that if Junis was available, he vote would have went to him with the 5 run cushion, but you just didn't feel good about anybody else in that bullpen. So it's kind of unfortunate with Emmanuel Clase. Um, if Emmanuel Clase was still part of this team, then he would have, we would have seen Clase at some point, and maybe Kate Smith would have been, or Clase would have been fresh, something like that. That Vogt would have been, it would have been a lot easier for Vogt to manage this bullpen if Emmanuel Clase didn't do Clase things in July. So, the last narrative I have for game two is that the Tigers left 15 men on base. This is an unsustainable trend, and this was kind of the precursor to game three, when the Tigers finally broke out of their slump with runners in scoring position. So game three, this is kind of where I had issues with how Stephen Vogt managed the game. So you had Slade Ciccone and Joey Cantillo sort of platooning as bulk guys in this game. I like the idea of this a lot. I was saying before the game how I wanted to see, Slade Ciccone go one time through the lineup, and if he looked good, leave him in there. And that's pretty much what happened. He looked pretty good one time through the lineup, and then he gave up a couple hits, and Vogt pulled him. I think Vogt pulled him at an appropriate time, and he went to Tim Herron, which, by the way, Tim Herron had a really good series. He really held it down in games one and or sorry, two and three of the series in the bullpen. And the Tigers bullpen was in much better shape in this game because of Tarek Skubal going 7 2/3 in game one, and then Tyler Holden getting a little bit of length in game two for the Tigers. So, um, but you had Slade Ciccone went 2 1/3, and then Tim Herron came in and finished off the third inning and limited the damage to 1 run. So that was huge. And then you had Joey Cantillo come in for 2 2/3 innings of relief work. And here's where my issue comes in with the way that Vogt managed this game. Joey Cantillo was rolling, and he gave up that solo home run to Dylan Dingler, and it was just a hanging changeup. It was he looked really good up until that point, and then Vogt pulled him, and then Eric Sabrowski gave up 2 runs, and then Hunter Gaddis gave up 2 more runs the next inning. So it kind of sucks, That's I think that Joey Cantillo could have finished the seventh inning. He could have at least given up less than 4 runs if he was given 4 extra outs. Like I said, he looked good. It was just an isolated home run. And given how depleted the bullpen was, you needed more length from one of your starters. And Joey Cantillo looked the better of the two out of him and Ciccone, in my opinion. Um, so yeah, you had Sabrowski and Gaddis throwing 3 days in a row. You also threw Kate Smith for the third day in a row in this game, but Kate Smith didn't pitch until the game was pretty much out of reach. So, Sabrowski and Gaddis both looked pretty gassed, and if they were fresh, I think they would have done fine. But since they pitched games one and two, the Tigers were familiar with how they looked, and most relievers can't come in and pitch 3 days in a row. Kate Smith is kind of a unicorn when it comes to, being able to pitch 3 days in a row and still be effective. Um, and then Matt Festa came in relief for Gaddis, and he looked completely fine. And then Jacob Junis shut them down. Jacob Junis probably pitched the cleanest inning of the day out of anyone in the bullpen. And you just wonder if Cantillo had went 4 innings of relief work, then Junis and Festa, maybe Junis would have gotten a couple innings of relief work in, and then you could have gone to Kate Smith for the ninth inning, and this game could look completely different. But that's not how it ended up going, and that's what we got to deal with as Guardians fans. You can't you could go through a lot of scenarios and look at what could have been. This was a very winnable series, and um, the offense just couldn't come through till it was too late. They capitalized on a Will Vest error, and they didn't have enough in the tank to put up a crooked number like they did in the eighth inning of game two, and it's just unfortunate. But hats off to the Tigers for they look pretty good in game three, and they beat us fair and square. they made mistakes throughout the series that the Guardians did not capitalize on, and we made mistakes. The Guardians made mistakes throughout the series that the Tigers capitalized on, and that ultimately ended up being the difference. Um, so kind of getting into my overall thoughts on the series, Kyle Manzardo didn't do anything. He missed that home run in game two, which granted would have been out in basically any other day. Other than that at bat, he looked awful at the plate, and he gave Ramirez no protection behind him. And Jose Ramirez, my biggest issue with the offense was that Jose Ramirez was getting the Barry Bonds treatment. And when you're the only feared hitter in the lineup, then they're just going to pitch around you and pitch to the other eight guys in the lineup. And Stephen Kwan didn't do anything the whole series either. You know, he had that double in the eighth inning of game two in the middle of that 5 run rally, which that was a good at bat, but he looked really bad in all of his other at bats. He wasn't being his typical self the whole series. He wasn't really working at bats. He was popping up, he was grounding out, he was just super short at bats out of Stephen Kwan, and he wasn't being that spark plug that we needed him to be. And that was something we saw throughout the whole second half from Stephen Kwan that we didn't get enough production out of him at the top of the lineup. So if Kwan and Manzardo aren't doing their jobs, then you can't expect a bottom three offense to get their way through a playoff series. Then yeah, that's just the unfortunate thing about it. When your best three hitter, well, yeah, really when your best three hitters aren't performing, then your pitching staff's got to be perfect. And I'd say the pitching staff did a pretty good job given the circumstances. Um, Back of the bullpen, like I said, was overused. I would have liked to have seen more of Jacob Junis this series personally. I think he could have been used in the same way that Tyler Holden was used for the Tigers. Honestly, Jacob Junis had a really good second half. I think his first half he struggled a lot, but he sneakily had a really good second half of the year, and I think he built up enough uh trust, at least in my opinion. To I if I was managing this team, I would have gone to Jacob Junis pretty comfortably in some medium leverage situations there. Um, and the starting pitchers did their jobs. Gavin Williams did amazing in game one. You couldn't really ask him to do much better. Unfortunately, we ran into Tarek Skubal and he just did a slightly better job. Tanner Bybee was really good for all intents and purposes. And then Saccone and Cantillo both were pretty decent. They did their jobs. So you can't really blame them on the starting pitching staff. Um, and just kind of getting into my ending thoughts on the season. Um, Getting eliminated in the wild card round doesn't really take away from how unforgettable this season was. It didn't end up the way that we wanted to as Guardians fans, but it doesn't, you know, it doesn't take away from that 20-7 run that we went on in September, erasing that 15 and a half game deficit to take the division. And you know, that division banner is always going to be flying in Progressive Field. So um that's yeah, it was an unforgettable month, but there's just the you can't forget that this team was just mediocre for a good majority of the year. And unfortunately, those holes kind of got exposed in the playoffs. So we just kind of ran out of luck, and yeah, that's just kind of the reality of it. But it gives me reason to feel good about this team in the future. Especially given the starting rotation, how dominant it was down the stretch. And there's so much pitching depth in the future with this team. Everyone's under Everyone in the starting rotation is under team control for at least the next 4 years out of the starting rotation in September. You know, Tanner Bybee has 4 years left in his deal. Gavin Williams is still pre-arbitration. Parker Messick just got called up. Logan Allen's still pre-arbitration. Um, Joe Cantillo's pre-arbitration, and Slade Ciccone just finished up his first full year in the big leagues. So yeah, this starting rotation is sticking around for a while. And then you also have John Means with a club option for next year, and then you have Ben Lively possibly returning next year, and then you have Cal Steven, pitching prospect we got in the Shane Bieber trade, hopefully coming up next year. So this team has a lot of starting pitching depth to work with, and in a later episode I'll kind of get into some trades that I'd like to see with given how much pitching depth we have and how the lack of offense that we have going forward. Um, and this lineup has an interesting future. Stephen Kwan had a really tough second half of the year, and that's kind of been the narrative with Stephen Kwan throughout his career is that he has a really good first half, and then he kind of slows down a lot in the second half. And um, the Guardians didn't. There's a lot of trade rumors going around with Stephen Kwan in the media, but I really don't see it. I think that if the Guardians wanted to trade him, they would have gotten the most out of him at this past trade deadline, and they're not gonna, and they didn't like the package that they got. So Stephen Kwan has 1 year left in his deal, and I think the Guardians are they're just gonna ride with him for his last year. They're not going to get enough value out of Stephen Kwan for what he ultimately the intangibles that he provides to this team. Um, and also, with George Valera and CJ Cavus and Chase DeLauter making their debuts and looking pretty good, the outfield looks pretty promising going forward. And then, Manzardo had a pretty solid first full season. Unfortunately, it didn't look very good in that three game playoff series, but he just needs to find a little bit more consistency and shorten up his swing. And I think he'll be a really solid major league player going forward. And you can't take away from the fact that he had 27 home runs this year. So that's really solid. Brian Rocchio and Gabby Arias look really solid in the middle infield defensively. And Brian Rocchio made a lot of steps forward this season offensively as well. So you love to see that. And another narrative that is pretty apparent is, where is Travis Bazzana going to play next year? Travis Bazzana, barring an injury, will probably be up at some point next year. And we kind of have a logjam in the outfield, and then, Gabby Arias and Brian Rocchio look like their their positions are not really up for grabs. So it's going to be interesting to see where Travis Bazzana plays next year. And Bo Naylor, given his success in September, he made a couple of mechanical adjustments, and I think I've been saying this for a couple of years, but I think that Bo Naylor can really have a breakout season next year. I just given that toe tap that he had and how much better his timing was, I think that he might have found something at the end of this year, and he looked really good in the playoffs too. And David Fry and Lane Thomas should be healthy next year too, so that'll give a little bit of that'll provide some right-handed bats. You never know with Lane Thomas. He's going to be a free agent at the end of the season, but I don't think he's going to really get any offers from any other teams. I think he's going to take a team-friendly contract next year. But that's where the Guardians stand. You could definitely look at it one of two ways. Like the Guardians, they don't spend any money on free agency, and they try to compete at the same time as developing, and they're always going to have a young roster. And you can say all you want about how the ownership is cheap and how we never sign free agents or any of that stuff, but we're given a competitive team year in and year out, and we're one of the best organizations in baseball as far as having a winning team every year. So although we haven't had really a juggernaut since that 2017 team. There's there's no reason for me to not believe that we have a contender next year as well. Um, so definitely mixed feelings about this season, but we ended the regular season on a good note, and unfortunately it didn't make the World Series, and that's a tall ask any year, and it's the playoffs are just a crapshoot. So that's what I have for the Guardians.
Yeah, I think, you know, our teams are in a similar spot heading into next year with a lot of pitching depth and a lot of really good young pitching that's going to be around for a while, and the offense, needs to be addressed. And we're in the same spot that we're both small market teams with front offices that don't really sign free agents. The Reds may be a little more aggressive in free agency, but they're not going to go out and sign the big names just like the Guardians aren't going to go out and do that. The only real difference is the Guardians front office seems to have figured out how to operate with a small payroll and be successful every year. And the Reds front office, um, I think they're trying to get there. I think that's ultimately what this front office wants to do is sort of become a Guardians like or a Brewers like team. But Um, they're not there yet, and they've made some pretty bad decisions in free agency, like Mike Moustakas and Jamer Candelario, to name a few. So you hope they can sort of remedy that this offseason. Um, but I'll get into the wild card takeaways for the Reds. I was sitting here thinking, why is Chris's, you know, portion of his wild card recap so much longer? And I realized it's you guys played an extra game.
Yeah.
Uh, you had the privilege of not being swept while the Reds only got to play two. And my October baseball shirt still isn't in, so it'll be funny when that comes in because they played one total game in October. So, but they'll never be able to take the shirt away from me. Um, so game one of this series, it was billed, as Hunter Green's going to make his playoff debut, and we have a real shot in game one because Hunter Green's going, and he struggled mightily in his playoff debut. We were, as if you listen to last week's episode, or if you really follow the Reds, this fan base was counting on Hunter Green to carry this team through this game, and he made it 3 innings of 5 earned run ball, and that puts undue strain on our bullpen for game two if we want to try and win that. It was just a really bad start from Hunter Green. There was some speculation that he was maybe tipping pitches. Um, I don't know how you can go from throwing a complete game shutout against the Cubs to the next week you're tipping your pitches. Maybe if he's nervous or it is a playoff start and it's in Dodger Stadium. So, maybe there's some nerves that caused his mechanics to be a little bit different and he started tipping pitches. But I haven't really seen any concrete proof. I think it's just people speculating. Um, the slider wasn't really working for him. He hung a slider to Teoscar Hernandez early that got deposited into the stands. Um, it was just a slider that sort of spun up there, middle in, and Teoscar did what he does to baseballs that are in that spot and crushed it. And he really seemed to be overthrowing the fastball a lot. That was something that was a problem for him early in his career, as he would overthrow the fastball and the control wasn't really there. Um, and he seemed to be doing that again. He was missing a lot glove side, which is typically a product of overthrowing, and he's throwing 101 and stuff, which that's not abnormal for Hunter Green, but when he's really going well, it's sitting at like 99, and he's dotting it. So that was part of it too, I think. Um, and funnily enough, because really all you can do is sit back and laugh at the end of the day at how this series went. It was Scott Barlow on national television going out there and shutting down the Dodgers for 1.2 innings. Um, I watching a thought came to me watching Scott Barlow, um, have the best outing of his life against the Dodgers. Because they also Connor Phillips came in this game as well in relief, and he got touched up by the Dodgers quite a bit too. And he has a very similar arsenal to Hunter in that it's a high velo fastball, and he's got a really good breaking pitch that he can throw for a swing and miss pitch pretty consistently. But he doesn't. He's got a third pitch. It's not great. He doesn't throw it a ton, so it's really like that fastball that's coming up at like 98 and then a really good breaking ball. And so I got to thinking, should the Reds have worked it so that Nick Lodolo was, saved and ready to start for game one and, used Hunter out of the pen in that Brewers game on Sunday, which is the reason why Nick Lodolo couldn't start against the Dodgers is we used him out of the pen in game 162. you know, mm, of course, hindsight's 2020, but it really seemed like the Dodgers, and it still continues to seem like the Dodgers are a team that really struggles against guys who aren't throwing super fast, but they've got pretty nasty breaking stuff, and they aren't really able to sit on one pitch like they were against Hunter and Connor Phillips. Um, and like I said, hindsight's 2020, but I think it it's an interesting, thought experiment because like I said, Scott Barlow shut the Dodgers down, and Scott Barlow is not a pitcher who should be shutting the Dodgers down. No disrespect to Scott Barlow, but The way that lineup hit for the entire series, it just, Scott Barlow is not the guy who's shutting that lineup down. So, and then Nick Lodolo came out in game two out of the pen, and he only got to throw 14 pitches, but he was really good in his 14 pitches. So, it's like if the Reds go Nick Lodolo and then maybe like Andrew Abbott in game one and two, do we have a better shot? And I think we probably do, just given on what I've seen from the Dodgers this postseason and how they're hitting, different styles of pitchers. Um, but there's nothing you can do about it now. The Reds did rally a little bit against some of the Dodgers' low leverage relievers in the eighth inning. They pushed across 5 runs in the game. Two of those were on Blake Snell, and then three were against the Dodgers bullpen. It was the first run the Reds have scored in the playoffs since 2013, so that was exciting to watch. And um, the innings that we there were a lot of innings in between when we had scored last in the playoffs. So that was nice. And it was nice to see them battle at the plate. They were down 8 runs at two different points in that game, and it would have been really easy to just call it a day and lose 8-2 or 8-0 or 10-2. But they didn't do that. And they made the Dodgers fans sweat a little bit, and they were showing the Dodgers fans in the stands, and they were needlessly concerned, and it was funny to watch them be scared in the stands. And they burnt 5 bullpen arms for the Dodgers, so maybe that hurts the Dodgers a little bit in the DS. You help the Phillies out a little bit, but uh, moral victories is really all you can take away from this series as a Reds fan. Um, Game two wasn't any better. The Reds did have their first playoff lead in, I think it was like 66 and 2/3 innings or something like that, since the Reds had held a lead in the playoffs. So they got a playoff. They had a lead in the playoffs for the first time in a long time. But it was really more of the same from the Reds. The only reason they had that lead was because Teoscar Hernandez is a terrible right fielder and shouldn't be in right field for the Dodgers at any point. But they capitalized on it. Other than that, it was pretty par for the course for the offense. They had the bases loaded with no outs, and they failed to score when they were down one. It's the second time it's happened to the Reds this season, which is kind of bad. Uh, it's something that the offense has to be addressed this offseason. You can rely on the young guys so much, but at some point you need a guy who can, can go up there and hit if you want to be a contender. Like the Guardians have J Ram. It's not a guy they went and got in free agency, but they have a guy in the lineup that they trust to hit in situations like that. The Reds, they don't really have anyone that they can trust, and they need to go sign someone that they can trust because, relying on young guys is great and all, and you want them to take the next step forward, but you can't, if you want to be a contender, you can't just assume they're going to take that next step.
What
I think
what
we
what
saw that.
I'm hearing is you need to sign Josh Bell in the offseason.
No, no. I believe, Frank the Tank from Barstool has confirmed that he's a Met, basically. No, no Josh Bell, please. He's
Josh
not.
Bell, Guardians and Reds are at the top of the Josh Bell sweepstakes.
There's going to be a bidding war for Josh Bell, and I'm sure we'll be in on it. Um, but yeah, no Josh Bells, please. I'm going to get into some guys I think maybe fill that need a little bit here in a bit. Sal Stewart was the one shining spot on this offense for me in game two. He drove in three. He took some, and he took some really good at bats. But, after the game, he gave some interviews and he was really critical of himself. He said he lost the team the game. Um, he had an error at first base where he overthrew Nick Martinez, who was coming to cover the bag, and that led to some Dodgers runs. And he struck out with the bases loaded in that no outs bases loaded situation, and he was really torn up and critical of himself. And I love to see it. He's 21 years old and he's going to be fighting for a spot on the roster next year. There's no guarantee that he'll be a Red. Come opening day, he might be a bat, but he plays with a lot of fire, and it's just awesome to see. He was the one guy who really gave an interview where it was like it seemed like he was taking the loss hard. Maybe I don't want to say that the other guys weren't, but he was the one guy who, it came through in his interview, which was nice to see. And he's going to be a huge piece of this team moving forward. And I'm excited to see what he becomes because I think he's got a really high ceiling. He took some, for a 21-year-old who started in double A this year, he took some really professional at bats against a really good Dodgers team in Dodger Stadium in the playoffs. And I think, that just points to his poise and how high his ceiling is. Uh, you know, in game two, the bullpen came in and they blew the game up really. Um, the pitching was incredibly disappointing in the series. They gave up 18 runs across two games, and I don't want to be too critical of them because the only reason we made it to the playoffs was because of our pitching staff. And they didn't show what they could do in this series. And I'm sure some of that is inexperience, but and probably fatigue. They were used a lot in the regular season, which is what got us to the wild card series. But um, you know, it's disappointing when you're expecting that you might have a chance because of how your pitching staff has performed all year, and then they don't really perform that way in the postseason. If you had told me, that this team scored 9 runs across two games, I probably would have guaranteed you that we won at least one of those games, given the way that our staff has performed all year. Um, in a game where the Reds score 5 or 4, I don't have the stats. It'd be a chore to look for them, I think. But I think we win a lot of games where we only score 4 runs this year, and the staff wasn't able to do it. Um, then part of that is because the Dodgers have a lineup that, I mean, every batter comes to the plate except for like Ben Rortvedt, and you're like, oh great, this guy's at the dish. Even Kike Hernandez seems to become an entirely different. He's Barry Bonds in October for some reason. He's Brett Phillips in the regular season, who just retired. Congrats to Brett Phillips
Yeah.
on his retirement. But then he's Barry Bonds in October, so you even have to deal with him. The overall season outlook, I think, is a positive one. I'm going to take a positive spin on it. There are a lot of people on Reds Reddit who are being negative about it, and I'm pretty sure the only people who post on Reds Reddit are people who want to be negative about the Reds. Um, but I'm trying to be positive about it. The playoff game and series winless streak live on. It's 2012 since we've won a playoff game and 95 since we've won a playoff series, but it's progress. It's a step forward, and I'm happy to see that. In 2023, I was happy to see them run out a team. I was enthralled that the Cincinnati Reds ran out a team that had a winning record. They were 82-80, and I thought it was the best thing that could ever happen to the Cincinnati Reds was having a record that was over 500 by one game. Um, so they were only one game better this year, but they made the playoffs. So it's another step forward. Um, they just, like I said, they happened to run into one of the best teams ever assembled, and their pitching staff wasn't up to snuff. Um, but they took the next step, and it can only be a positive experience for this group of guys to get some playoff experience. Um, it was a lineup that had never really experienced this before, and they got to go through the stress of a playoff push that lasted the entire season, and they came out on the other side of it. They ended up, they made the playoffs. Sure, it was because the Mets had a terrible collapse, but they had to be there to take it. Someone had to be there to take advantage of the Mets collapsing, and it was this team that was able to do it. And these guys got to experience that. They got to experience playing in a playoff atmosphere. Granted, Chavez Ravine was basically a library for all 18 innings, but they were there. They got to experience it, and it's going to be a lot of the same guys next year. So it's not, this isn't a one and done team. So a lot of the guys who got their first taste of playoff baseball this year are going to be back next year. Um, Looking at free agency this offseason, it's, the two big guys coming off the books are Nick Martinez and Emilio Pagan. Austin Hayes has a mutual option and Scott Barlow has an option. So the front office, is going to have some money to play with. and we have a lot of pitchers, just like the Guardians do. So you hope that they can maybe spend some of that money on a bat. Looking at the contracts with Martinez and Pagan off the books, you free up 29 million. You add Scott Barlow and Austin Hayes to that, and you're up to 36.5 million for next year. Um, that can get you a pretty good bat in the big leagues for a year or two. I think, Eugenio Suarez and Josh Naylor are both free agents this offseason. I think you could realistically go get one of those guys with that kind of money. Um, you could even play you're familiar with Cincinnati card with Eugenio and see if that helps him a little bit. Um, it's up to the front office to do it though, and they don't have a great track record of that. I think it reminds me of 2020 a little bit. I think that was pre Nick Krall maybe, but you know in 2020 the Reds thought they had a chance to compete and they went out and signed Nick Castellanos. Um, he eventually got traded in the big fire sale when the Reds decided to blow that group up, but um they went out and got Nick Castellanos that year when they thought they compete, and I hope that's what they do this offseason. And one thing that gives me some hope is that since the young group of Steer and McLean and Ellie all came up, this front office has pointed to 2026 as the year that they feel like this team is going to be really ready to compete. They took step one of that this year by hiring Tito and making the playoffs. I think they brought Tito in maybe to he now has a this team now has a year of experience with him, with his managerial style, with how he wants them to play the game. And so next year they're going to be more familiar with that. Um and you hope that helps them be a little bit more comfortable and a little bit more successful. And my hope is that this offseason they're willing to address the clear need for some offense and really go push some chips in for 2026 and help this team be the competitive team that I think a lot of Reds fans really, really hope and dream it can be. But that's all I have for my Reds for right now.
Yeah, I think what she said about Hunter Green is interesting. I think that he should have you should have seen Hunter Green in some fashion
Hmm.
in the
Hmm.
wild card series. I don't think you can not pitch your ace in a playoff series. I think it's unfortunate the way that it unfolded. He was throwing 100 like I watched the game with you like we he was overthrowing and it was
Yeah,
apparent he was rattled and the moment just kind of got to him and you can't really do anything about that. He's a guy that, had a track record. He threw a one-hit shutout, complete game shutout like 3 weeks prior. Um, so that's the guy that you had to go with in that
yeah,
situation. And the yeah, like you said, the Dodgers were just a bad matchup for the Reds in the wild card series. I think that I don't know if the Reds could have handled like the Cubs or somebody or the Padres in a wild card series, but I think they would have at least had a better shot against one of those teams instead of the Dodgers.
definitely.
But moving into some other happenings around the league and playoffs, the uh, the Red Sox and Yankees series was really interesting. Um, so if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so the Red Sox won game one. The Yankees become the first team to advance in the wild card round after losing game one. They win games two and three. They get a lot of help in game three from their rookie pitcher, Cam Schlittler. He went 8 innings of shutout ball. I think he had like 12 strikeouts or something like that. Super impressive from him. And Alex Cora in game three, I think made some real head scratching decisions. In games three and two, made some real head scratching decisions with the pitching. In game two, I think the Red Sox had a lead or it was tied in the eighth, and they needed 4 outs, and he didn't bring Chapman in. I think if you bring Chapman in there, maybe you have a better shot at winning that game. But yeah, the Yankees took care of the Red Sox. That was fun to see that rivalry in the playoffs. And then the Padres and Cubs series was, another one that went 3 games. The Reds were the only team to get swept this year. Um, the Cubs won game one, Padres took game two, and then the Cubs came back to win game three. The Padres did get hurt by a terrible strike three call by the home plate umpire in game three. They could have had the bases loaded with no outs in the ninth inning, down a run, I think, or down two, something like that. Um, and Xander Bogaerts got rung up on a ball that was probably not in the zone, and that hurt the Padres when it all came down to it. I think the big thing for the Padres, though, is that Fernando Tatis was nowhere to be found. He's usually a guy that steps up in the playoffs, and I think he went hitless in the wild card round. So that's pretty bad if you're the Padres. And then Dansby Swanson played amazing shortstop defense all series, and he kind of beat the Padres with his glove more than anything. Um, I'd be a little concerned if I was a Padres fan right now. They went all in with the trades this year to, win the West this year and make a World Series run. And they depleted their farm system a lot, and they have quite a few guys on expiring contracts. So, I'd be worried if I was a Padres fan that, all you got out of this front office pushing all their chips in was a wild card round exit. But that's how the other two wild card series went.
Yeah, I think that, well, the Padres were in a really tough situation earlier this year with I don't know the full story behind it, but somebody one of the owners, the previous owner died, I believe, and then
Hmm.
his son
Hmm.
took over, and then his son is a little bit, it was kind of his dying wish to see the Padres win a World Series, and he pushed all of his chips in to make that happen. And then fast forward a couple years later, the Padres pushed all their chips in again at the trade deadline. So you never know like what, the Padres are a big market and they could just make something happen within the next couple years. Um, but yeah, they did deplete their farm system, so that is something to keep in mind. But moving into the division series, the Cubs and the Brewers, I watched most of that game. Um, the Brewers looked really good. I feel like they're kind of doing away with that narrative that they just get bounced in round one of every playoff series. They looked really dominant in that game one, and the Brewers are just a fun team. They're like the Guardians, except an absolute juggernaut. Like the Brewers are what the Guardians were trying to be this year. Um, they have guys like, Blake Perkins and Caleb Durbin who are uh making contributions. They're doing more than Stephen Kwan or like Kyle Manzardo did. Um, they got contributions from everyone in that game one, and that was and then Freddie Peralta had a really good game as well. Freddie Peralta is a super underappreciated pitcher. I don't know if he's really underrated, but I think underappreciated.
Yeah, this was a fun series for me to watch. Two NL Central teams battling it out, two teams that I'm familiar with. Um, and I'm rooting for the Brewers in this series. I'm just not a fan of the Cubs. And it was fun to watch the Brewers do it to someone else and be on the end where I was getting to enjoy to watching the Brewers sort of do their thing. Because it was stereotypical Brewers ball in that game. They ran the bases well. They took their base hits. I don't think they had a home run, and they still won the game like
Mhm.
9-3 or something. Um, and that's just the way the Brewers play baseball. They pitch well and they run the bases well. They play exceptional defense. Um, and they're not trying to, they just want to hit the ball gap to gap. They're not trying to drive it out of the ballpark. Um, and the Cubs had a really costly error in the first inning. Nico Horner whiffed on a ground ball that let the Brewers score another run. Um, but yeah, just that was Brewers ball to a T in game one of that series.
Yeah, Pat Murphy. There was a story that came out about Pat Murphy about how I think he benched Sal Frelick in a game because he made a mental error or something,
Mhm.
and Pat Murphy really holds people accountable for playing the game super clean, and that's just something that starts from the top down. And the Brewers are just a really admirable organization. Moving on to the Phillies and Dodgers, this is another really fun series to watch. The Phillies, unfortunately, lost 5-3 in game one. But game one was super entertaining. I thought the Phillies were going to rally back there. They looked really good the first part of the game, and they were making things happen the offense. But that Shohei just settled in that game, and he kind of stifled their offense. And they didn't have. It was interesting to see what the Dodgers did with their bullpen because Tyler Glasnow came out of the bullpen in that game, and you never really have seen Tyler Glasnow out of the bullpen. And then Roki Sasaki was their closer. So the the Dodgers are just rocking with their starting rotation, like what they thought their starting rotation was going to be in the beginning of the year to just like hold down their entire pitching staff, whether that is actually starting games or getting, bullpen appearances. But Shohei getting 6 innings was huge for them. I thought Shohei was going to get bounced after 3 or 4 innings, so that was super impressive. But yeah, the Dodgers, they're inevitable.
Yeah, it's, I don't really want to see the Dodgers win another one. I don't really like the Dodgers but they're a really good team. I coming into it, I thought the Phillies would be able to expose the Dodgers bullpen and we're still only one game in, but the Dodgers are using Tyler Glass now and Roki Sasaki out of the bullpen, so they don't have to use the guys who are struggling out of their bullpen. Um, so that really helps the Dodgers out. Teoscar Hernandez came up huge with the 3-run home run um, in game one, and the Phillies, stars were super quiet in that game. Bryce Harper was 1 for 4. Trey Turner might have been 1 for 4. Kyle Schwarber, I don't think had a hit. Um, and in spite of how good Shohei was on the mound, he was not good at the plate. He went 0 for 4 with a walk. He had 4 strikeouts. So, I think it'll be interesting to see how he performs when he's not pitching um, this series. I thought the bullpen usage from the Phillies was pretty interesting too, and I think it may have cost them the game a little bit. Now, I'm not too familiar with the Phillies bullpen. I can't say for sure. That was just my armchair analysis.
Yeah, I can't say I'm that familiar with the bullpens either. David Robertson was an interesting addition after the trade deadline and free agency. I thought that Robertson was going to get signed sooner because he had a really good season last year. But anyway, getting into the Yankees and Blue Jays series, I that was probably the most fun for me to pay attention to. Um, we both have. I'm sure you guys know how we feel about the Yankees, but it's just so fun to see the Blue Jays exposing the Yankees. Um, the Blue Jays scored 23 runs in the first 2 games, and then I had never heard of Trey Savage before yesterday, but he threw 5 1/3 innings of no hit ball, and that was super impressive against the that Yankees lineup. Um, I like the Blue Jays. I like their odds. The Indians at the time were they had a 2 game lead on the Yankees in 2017 ALDS, the same way that the Blue Jays do now. But the difference, the Yankees were in both of those games that they lost. The Yankees have just gotten blown out 2 games in a row. Um, so it'll be really interesting to see how they perform at Yankee Stadium the next couple games, or if the Blue Jays end up sweeping them. So that's a really fun series to watch. But the Blue Jays are such a fun team. What's his name? The catcher, um,
Alejandro Kirk.
Alejandro Kirk. That was so fun to see him hit 2 home runs. So
Yeah, that was an the Blue Jays just look like an absolute juggernaut right now. If I was anyone in the AL or anyone in the NL, I'd be pretty scared to face them right now. Vladdy has turned it on for the postseason, and they're playing without Bo Bichette too. He's hurt. He might be back, I think, at some point in the postseason, but they're without Bo Bichette right now, who's another key piece of that team. But they've got guys like Ernie Clement stepping up, Addison Barger. Um, someone was 4 for 5 yesterday with 4 extra base hits. I can't remember who it was, but it was some like random Blue Jay.
Was it
Blue Jay.
Nathan? Was it Nathan Lucas?
It might have. I don't think so,
Oh,
but that's another guy who's stepping up for them.
yeah, Nathan Lucas is slept on.
It feels like, I it feels like a Blue Jays Brewers World Series is sort of the ideal matchup, with
I
the
would love
teams
to see
left,
that.
aside from maybe the Mariners,
Yeah.
who's they're a team that we both really like. But the Blue Jays and the Brewers are pretty similar in a lot of ways in that they play really, really good defense, and they don't strike out a lot. Both of those teams put the ball in play a lot. So I think that'd be a really fun World Series matchup. Um, I think the Blue Jays haven't won a World Series in a while. The Brewers have never won one, so that would be cool to see too.
Yeah, I think it's been since either the late 80s or early 90s since
Yeah,
the Blue Jays have won a World Series. I think they won a couple in a short time period back then. But
yeah.
um, anyway, moving on to the Tigers and Mariners series. This is another really fun series to watch. It's a 1-1 tie so far. Game one went to 11 innings. Um, the Mariners took the season series over the Tigers 4 games to 2. But they've been two very evenly matched ball games so far. Terry Skubal had a pretty characteristic start yesterday. He pretty much stifled that Mariners offense, and the Mariners, they got that clutch hit, and the Tigers got the clutch hit in game one. So it's a very evenly matched series, and yeah, it's fun. Jorge Polanco hitting 2 runs, home runs off of Terry Skubal was really cool as well. Um, you're also getting to see playoff Josh Naylor as well in full force. Josh Naylor just missed that home run in game one. He got kind of Manfred balled there, where that might have been a dead ball. You could say what you want about it, but I thought that was hit 600 feet to the third deck.
Yeah. Yeah, this has been a good series. The Mariners are sort of the AL team that I root for. They have a lot of former Reds on the team, and they're a big trade partner with the Reds oftentimes. Or, the Guardians, um, sort of have the Brewers, and I would say that the Mariners are Brewers in that way. Um, Obviously, there's the Griffey ties to. Um, I Julio Rodriguez has been huge for the Mariners in this series so far. He had a home run in game one, and then he had the big hit last night to ultimately put the winning run on the board for the Mariners. Julio Rodriguez is a guy that he is what he is. He's not. I think he's a little overrated personally. But he's turned it on in the postseason. I'd love to see him continue it and maybe prove me wrong a little bit.
Yeah, he's a good player. I think that for how fast he came on his rookie year, I think he set
Mhm.
his ceiling super high, and he hasn't exactly lived up to that. But I think he still has that potential at any given moment to be that superstar that he is expected to be. So,
Yeah.
you have a couple more storylines to touch on before we get out of here.
Yeah, just a few more real quick. Bruce Bochy did part ways with the Rangers, but Buster Posey has said that he's not going to come back to manage the Giants. That was something we touched on last week, but it seems like it'll not be the case. So the Rangers hired Skip Schumacher to take over as their manager. He was the Marlins manager the last couple years. So the managerial carousel has begun, and then Mets fans got more bad news um, late last week after they were eliminated from playoff contention. Pete Alonso is going to test out free agency. Um, I think it'll be interesting to see where he ends up. He's a guy that you kind of know what you're going to get from him. It's a lot of home runs. The average isn't. He had a pretty decent average year by his standards this year, but he's not by a high average guy by any means. But you're signing him for the home runs. He's got I think the one big storyline to watch is if his defense is going to hurt his paycheck because he's kind of getting into that Kyle Schwarber territory where you're not going to play him anywhere in the field and you're just going to sign him to be a DH. He had -8 fielding run value this year. So it'll be interesting to see if teams are willing to, pony up a lot of money, even if they know that they're not getting a guy who's going to play any defense or any meaningful defense. I think he'll be signed exclusively as a DH when a deal is done.
Yeah, I mean, you saw how JD Martinez ended up this year. He provides like a little bit above league average offense, but he can't play anywhere in the field, and he didn't get any offers this year, despite the
Yeah.
fact that he would have helped a lot of teams. So I think it could definitely go one of two ways. Pete Alonso has a lot of just name value by this point in his career, but yeah, his fielding value has definitely gone down, but he could still play first base if needed.
Yeah.
Um, so I think there are some teams that I feel like would be desperate enough to get Pete Alonso on their team and pony up $30 million a year or something like that.
Yeah.
So um, that's all we have for this week. It was a little bit of a longer episode, so if you made it this far, thank you so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed us talk about our we covered a lot of ground in this episode. But yeah, don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, give us 5 stars on Spotify, and comment down below what you thought about the Reds or the Guardians and the playoffs and what your outlook is. We'd love to hear from you guys. So thanks again for listening.
Yeah. Thank you.